Rethinking the workspace. I mean, you know the Pectin, it is a well-known brand that is on the one hand a good thing, on the one hand not so good a thing, because of course anything that goes wrong around the world, and we operate in many different countries, and sometimes also difficult countries, is playing back to us. So if you look at Shell's strategy, I think the core bit of it is that we have an upstream business. We're trying to get oil and gas out of the ground, and then we have a downstream business where we basically refine into products transported around the world, but also managed a huge amount of assets. For example, 43,000 retail sites. And that's where one of the challenges start, because although, take the retail business for example, where we serve 10 million customers a day, we only have 2,500 direct employees related to that business. But we've got 500,000 people who are actually wearing Shell clothes and serving these customers on a day-to-day basis. And one of the challenges we have as generations move on is how do you embrace that community? How do you make sure that these people, when they engage with you, when you hopefully fill up your tank with us, feel like, touch like, speak like an organization that is representing the brand you would like to see? And that poses quite a lot of interesting specific challenges for the HR side. We also look at the future, obviously. This business has been around for 120 years, and you can only do that if you constructively and consistently take a 5, 10, 15-year period forward. It's an important point to make, because when I looked at a lot of the presentations today, they're deeply rooted in the realities of today and also the urgencies of today. We're operating in a capital market where people want to receive results, quarter by quarter. But many of the businesses represented in this room today are only here because in the past people thought about what would happen 5, 10, 15 years ahead. And because they thought about it, they made the right investment, which allowed specifically companies who've been around a bit longer to stay around. But of course, also companies represented in this room who have a very short history, and where the model is working very well right now, but will it 5 and 10 years from now? And the important thing is that if you look at talent management, which is one of the key points around this room, we try to look at people's career 10, 20, 30 years. And whether they have that career within our one company or within many companies doesn't really matter. If you don't constructively think about that, your skills and capabilities won't be there when you need them. So we also look at growth engines. I mean, the deep sea symbol that you see there, and also the whole Arctic are areas, of course, that you're familiar with. Very importantly, for all these strategies, wherever you go in a business, you need people capability. Now, Shell is investing about 35 billion every year in terms of new projects. That's a lot of money. And it's important that you invest it in a way that you can secure that you get that investment back. I think that's probably true for all of us. So at the end of last year, we had about 92,000 employees. The average age was 41, which if I would look around in this room, you would have companies with a lot lower average rate and of a lot higher. Averages, by the way, are always things that you need to be careful about. Because specifically in our growth areas, if you look at Asia, I think obviously the age is a lot longer, shorter. And if you look at European market, I think the average age will be a lot higher. We hire a lot of people from the market, about 1,200 graduates and over 3,000 experienced hires last year. And we tried to continue doing that. I mean, the good thing about getting talent from the outside world is that you actually bring the new generation in. It sounds very obvious, but if you don't take that step, it's very hard to adapt to the environment in which you operate. And more we do that for our growth market. So you see a lot of growth of the graduates, for example, in Asia. And you have to adapt as a company, because if you don't, these people will very rapidly leave you. So it creates a sort of pressure inside the organization. And I saw in some of the contributions the talk about diversity. That's always the easy bit. If you have a large brand, and many large brands are represented in this room, you can hire diverse people. But do you really ensure that the skills and the capabilities and the ways of working of these people get a fair attention in the organization, which is a topic of inclusion? And we found that leadership had to adapt to that. So rather than pointing fingers, say you're different than me, is embrace, build bridges with people that are different than you. And I come back to that topic because it's quite critical for dealing also with new generations as they come through the organization. If you look at the HR journey, I mean, the details are not important here, but what is important is that about 10 years ago, like many other represented in this room, we started investing heavily in the IT backbone for a global organization. We operate in more than 100 countries, and if you want to have an HR structure and system that delivers you data, you need to build an IT platform around it, which we did with SAP. Painful, by the way. Not so much because of the amount of money that it took and the time it took, but standardization is just painful. And I pledge today not only to talk about success stories, but also where it was tough, where with good intent we tried stuff and found it really difficult. Now, the real difficult thing we found around standardization is that you lose a bit of the personal touch at the local level. And for any company that's represented here that's trying to deal with global, with virtual, there's this balance act of having fantastic standardized processes in HR. We have about 22, but also the look and feel and touch at a local level. Because if it doesn't feel personal, if are not touched by the head and hearts, I think sometimes we fail with our global processes. So one of the trends we've seen over the last 10 years is from that standardization, we're now slowly but gradually also accepting a level of local adaptation that allows us to be more effective. And I think it's easier to standardize and then give a bit of space locally than do it the other way around. I think the other thing we're seeing is we have now about 10,000 people working in shared services. And I think the connect, about 1,000 of those are working in HR. The connect of these people with your total delivery model, this is the famous Zurich triangle, was very hard because we had different classes of citizen. We haven't outsourced our shared services. These are Shell people. They work in shared services in Krakow, in Manila, and also in Malaysia. But to fully connect the people with what they're doing, with the larger projects, with the businesses, is something that we invested a lot of time on, and I think we're still not completely there. The other thing we found out is that over time, when people in the shared service are working on key processes, they actually know more about these things than the so-called experts in the center, which is very painful. So if you're dealing day on, day out with a certain issue around the 9,000 expats that we have in Shell who work outside their home country, you become really an expert. Not expert based on theory, but expert based on practice. I think one of the good side effects is that over time, and we are working with the shared service model now for more than 10 years, we see the skills and the capabilities building up. For those people familiar with a tiered service delivery model, you see the shared services actually building that capability within their own domain. So I think the next step, the next evolution is really the customer interface. Using a lot of the IT tools that are represented today, and I walked around a bit, I saw many of them, so that you can create that environment where people who are used with their own devices, social networks, etc., feel engaged and you grab their hearts and minds. If you look at the leadership capability, a very important point to make here is you can make all the investment, you can make the look and feel of a very modern and nice system. But in the end of the day, the leadership capability that is required to operate in a virtual world is something where we had to pause, had to stop really what we have been doing for many years and rethink. And what I want to share with you in a couple of minutes is where we landed. What sort of leadership is required to be effective in a more virtual world? What leadership is required to actually embrace the different generations in a way that everybody is attracted by it. We used to have a very elaborate model of leadership capabilities. We called the 9 planets. In typical engineering fashion, Shell's an engineering company. There was big books describing all the details of the 9 planets. And if you would put me on the stand today, I could probably do 6 or 7, but I could never do the 9. And I think that's one of the things we changed. So we said, let's make it simpler. And let's also use a language for those planets that is emotive, that people can attach to. And we came up with 4. And I think it's probably worthwhile to talk a bit about them. So one of the most important leadership capabilities we thought about was growth. The capability to take an activity, whatever it is, and make it bigger than it is. Whether that's in terms of revenue, whether it's in terms of market share, whether that's in terms of efficiency, because that's not as easy as it sounds. And people's leaders' capability to grow something means that you also need to take risk, that you need to be disruptive. And we found out that we had very good leaders, but typically their capability was not in this growth space. They were far better in the maintain. And I think I urge you to think about your own company at this moment and think, how many leaders do we really have in a large enterprise who have the entrepreneurial skills to take an activity and make it larger than what it is right now? So growth, very important one. The second one we came on is, of course, performance. And I don't need to sort of elaborate on that. I just mentioned the point that in the world of today, our investors are looking over our shoulder on a day-to-day basis. And wherever you are in the organization, you have to deliver. You need the performance. So you can have a nice talk, you can have a fantastic engagement, but if the results at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year aren't there, so performance is a very important point. And then we talked about collaboration. And not so much collaboration, building bridges with people that are like you, but specifically the skill to reach out, to build meaningful relationships, partnerships with customers, with stakeholders, with people that are decisively different than you. And that can be generational, and that can be because of the culture where people come from, that can be because of the language that people speak. So the leadership capability to reach out and to collaborate, to work together with people that are decisively different than yourself. And again, I would pause here and think about how that is in your own company. Because if you're stretching, because if you're successful in what you do, and that's probably why you're here, because you want to grow, it's so important that we very early on in people's careers, from a talent management perspective, learn people to build bridges with people that are different than themselves. And many companies don't do that, because you build careers through silos, through specific skills and capabilities in one group, because it's easier. And my plea is to think about, be disruptive early on in people's careers, make them learn how to build those bridges, because it's a muscle that you will need in the world going forward. And the most interesting, and the one we had the most debate on, is the last one, and it's authenticity. And we try to decode what would make people energized and interested in working with leaders. And we found out that most people are capable to deal with all kinds of idiosyncrasies of leaders, as long as they were authentic, as long as they felt that the person they were talking to, engaging with, was for real. And for real is very much around purpose. So what is it that drives you? A very simple way to think about it is what makes you tick, what wakes you up in the morning. And we found that for an engineering company that Shell predominantly is, that was a very difficult one. Because a lot of people said, so do I have to talk a lot about myself and what drives me and what makes me enthusiastic? Yeah, that's part of it, but it's not really what it is. Purpose is really the why you're doing things. And it's something that we typically don't spend enough of time on. And I think as a company, we have to learn to be far clearer about the purpose. We need leaders who have the capability to reach out on what their purpose is and how they try to translate it in what they do. So growth, performance, authenticity, and the collaboration skills. I mean, we found out that these were probably the most important for us. Once you've done that, and it doesn't really matter what it is, but you have to integrate it in all you do. So you have to start to change your language. So yeah, when you have senior management conversations around talent, you have to bring the language into the room. So you have to start to profile people along those criteria that you use and say, okay, how are people doing against it? And we're right in the middle of that. Because if they're disconnected, if your talent management is disconnected from your leadership development, your learning interventions, and how you actually do your performance management, this has absolutely no meaning and you will fail. And so the jury's out. We just started a couple of years ago with this. The other thing we learned is the huge value, you probably know that, of peer coaching, but we didn't pay enough attention on it. Your capability to actually line up people who help others, for example with collaboration, with the authenticity bit, is a hugely powerful thing. So the key point here is, yes, there's all this new technology. Yes, there's also the capability, IT infrastructure, very nice interfaces. But at the end of the day, if you think back about qualities such as authenticity, isn't that something that has been around always? If I look back 25 years of my career, what are the most impressive bosses that I worked for? That was certainly not the most easy people. But there were the people who I knew by the look at their face, by the way they expressed themselves, where they were, because they were so deeply rooted in their own beliefs, in their own purpose. I think when it comes to collaboration, I was most impressed with people who could grab an audience wherever it was in the world and build that sort of relationship. And when it comes to performance, obviously the results over time counts. So a very important way to deal with the challenges is indeed to focus on what sort of qualities you want your leaders to have. And if there's a discrepancy between where you are today and where you want to be really clear about that. The last thing about leadership is it doesn't work top-down. It's probably obvious, but we've done it all the time. So you come with great process systems and tools, and then you forget that learning only takes place when people want to learn something. Everybody knows about the 70-20-10. We always ignore this basic 70%, the learning that takes place on the job. Do we provide people with the opportunities and the skills to actually have that learning and then take the results of that? And the mistakes we made is that we had too few jobs where people could make mistakes. Because it's through making mistakes that you learn most. And I think one of the things we're challenged by right now is we're so well organized in many shapes and forms that this basic capability to fall on your nose. I always say to my team, you only learn to ride a bike by doing it. If I give you a book about it, it doesn't help. I mean, you have to fall on your nose, step back on the bike, and then you learn it. So I think that is an important part there. HR business partnering, the only thing I want to say about that, because it's still very dominant wherever I go in the world, and we operate in 72 countries. We should stop that language. I left it on the team who prepared the slide for me, but I really don't believe in business partnering. What I believe in, that the HR function, for now and for the future, is a part of the business, or it's not. So this partnering word makes me nervous in the first place. I've never heard a marketing manager talk about being a business partner. This is something that has been invented and we get very excited about, but we shouldn't. So we have to speak the language, you have to understand the depth of the business that you support, and then you're part of it, and when you sit at a table, you have an equal voice around that table. And I think it's it sounds like a word game, but it is not. It's a thought I would like to leave you with. I think you should be part of the business, not a partner of it. So some learning points to close. Transformation, all the things you've heard about, I mean, it's not something that you can change overnight, and I wouldn't advise you to do. People, whether we like it or not, don't like change. And you have to provide the environment that they can. The top-down approach works on a burning platform, which, by the way, in my business is not something that you desire. And it is really, really only going to be effective if you create the environment where people want to adapt. Grass doesn't grow faster by pulling it. And I think we all know it, but we still do it. All elements, so the talent management, your backbone in terms of IT infrastructure, your learning interventions, your relationship with most senior management, your clarity of objective and purpose, all these parts need to be strong. You have to balance cost efficiency and user experience. Because at the end of the day, if it's a very efficient HR process, but everybody hates it, it's not going to work. And last but not least, I mean, look really at the fundamentals. So yes, there are innovative ways to deal with people, but in the end, they are people. And you have to connect the hearts and minds, I think, and then we will have the success. So let me stop there and open up for any questions.
Great, thank you. So can I take some questions? Yes, we've got one at the back. Thank you.
Hi.
Come to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Stephanie. You talked about 70% of the learning happening on the job. Couldn't agree more with you. And you also talked about the fact that you had a lot of jobs that just weren't allowed to make mistakes. We have the same issue. Our senior management is very nervous about people making mistakes. And I would say we probably have a culture of finger pointing. And I would be interested to find out, how did you change from we have a lot of jobs where you can't make mistakes, to a job where people are actually allowed and feel comfortable?
Yeah. So I think excellent questions. Thanks for it. I mean, I'm not saying that we have the ultimate recipe. Let me first be honest about it, because otherwise I wouldn't have mentioned it. But where it seems to work is a couple of things. First, role models. Sounds bloody obvious, but if you have role models, senior leaders who are openly talk about things they tried and failed at, the learnings they took from it, senior leaders who put people on stage to talk about things that went wrong and applaud the learnings and what happened after that. So I think these very basic things not only help, but I believe that if senior leadership doesn't really support it, get it, live it, believe it, forget it. I mean, you'll never change the culture, because if the CEO doesn't get it, it's just like with talent management or learning. People who want to know exactly what every dollar in learning spent will get in terms of an output, those folks will not make it. So I hope that answers your question a bit. I think other things we're trying to do is reshape jobs a bit, because we all have parts of our business where we don't want mistakes. So be really clear about the spaces where you can allow people to experiment and to learn. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have to put a finger on the same point, because myself also coming from oil and gas industry, I know we are in a very risky business. So I would be interested to have a very concrete example about where you allow your people to have this mistake culture or to test and try.
That's always easiest to take your own example, of course. When I worked in Germany as I was the HR manager for a retail business, I introduced quite a lot of new stuff. I mean, in Germany at the time, HR was still very much personnel administration. I introduced what I thought was some excellent stuff to deal with leadership and performance management, a whole raft of other things. Then one day they promoted me to become the marketing manager in that same business, and I had to eat my own dog food. So I basically had to implement...
That's the metaphor, right?
Yes, that's a metaphor. And it is so revealing and frustrating in a way, but from that moment in time was really painful, because a lot of things were far too cumbersome, they were not practical. I certainly had a whole bunch of reports where I had to deal with that you never in your life, anytime, will forget that really basic emotion that I had then. So anytime that people come with a great idea to me, I say, have we thought about its implementation? So that's one specific example. I mean, another one in the marketing space, I came up with a helmet for children, these cycle helmets. I introduced it in October, which is in Germany, which is too late, because then the bicycles go in the bicycle shed. But a far more fundamental mistake I made was it was red with yellow dots. And I thought it was great, but I didn't test the children. And I think one of the fundamental things I learned, and sometimes in HR we still make the mistake, is that we are very excited about our product. But is the person at the receiving end? They're still driving around, by the way. When you go to Germany, we made 80,000 of them, cost a lot of money. We never sold one, but they're driving around. They're driving around in these children education schools. So I think these are two examples. They're real. They're from my own life. I'm still here. I still made a bit of a career, but it was painful. We had to write off quite a lot of money there. But the learning was, test your customer base. Thank you. Sorry.
I had a quick question as well. We're talking about virtual working and dealing with diversity. We had a lot of conversations yesterday about Gen Y and the differences. Do you find that generation who's grown up with a lot of networking and kind of virtual friendships are better at that than the Gen Xers and the older generation, who perhaps are much more, they're comfortable with face-to-face, not so comfortable on the phone, or not so comfortable on the internet? I mean, is that something you found?
No, I think we perhaps two observations there. So first of all, leading people from the newest generation is not necessarily best done by people from the next generation. We've learned that. So I think we have excellent leaders who are far older who actually can deal with that, partly because they dealt with it with their children, I think.
Right.
And this is not joking, it's just a reality that you sometimes face. More specific, when it comes to virtual work, yes, and we of course bring your own device and stuff like that. But we also introduced a few really basic and simple things to help virtual working. One of the things I do, and I said I deal with 72 countries, I've got people dispersed, team of 600 people. Every couple of minutes before I have a global conversation with somebody in a place like India or whatever it is, I just load the web page of the local paper and I go through what's happened that day. And the first couple of minutes of a conversation, I reference whether it's a big sports event, a political event, a natural event, doesn't really matter. And you know what? That small investment makes a huge difference, because suddenly that distance between you and that person in a completely different time zone and country sort of appears far smaller than it is. Yeah. So I think that's just, these are practical things you can do to make working in a virtual world a lot more, where you connect hearts and minds of people. Yeah.
Fantastic. Gerard?
Sorry, there was one more, I think.
There was, yes, right, sorry. My apologies, it's in the light.
A question about how you support people doing the international moves. So what are the key things, because you have so much experience in helping people settle into a new country, what are the key things that you help people learn to make that transition work?
Yeah, you're talking about the expatriate population.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, so first of all, we have enthusiastic people in the countries where we move people into that help. And strange enough, that's typically more important for the spouses, or not strange enough if you think about it. So we have a whole support network, typically organized by spouses of these 9,000 expats that we have, which really helps on practical stuff. Cultural component, clothing, food, the whole thing. So that's one. Secondly, depending on where we get the country, the nature of the country, people get very detailed briefings. So we have people operating in places like Iraq or in Nigeria, where basically you have machine guns around you the whole day. That is something that requires a bit more than a half an hour conversation about the fact that Monday you're expected in Lagos. Yeah, and so because we've done it so many years, we got used to it. We've got an intelligence organization which gathers security data in each of those countries, working together with the MI5s, etc. So that is part of it. It is. If you have such a large community, which comes at about a quarter of our total payroll cost, it's really important that you prepare these people. If they're not prepared, they will fail in their assignment. So we do that, and typically that works out well, but it is not always easy. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's take one more question.
Yeah. Gerard, you spoke very passionately about HR partnering and your loathing thereof.
Yes.
And the behaviour, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
What do you see the consequence of people being obsessed with HR partnering rather than being in the business? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is, what do you think the root cause of that is?
Yeah, now my personal belief is that it all starts with the mindset that you have. So any relationship you build with anybody. So if I believe that I move into a culture with people who don't understand how to socially work together, I will see things in these people that are not helpful. So if it starts with mindset, HR leadership for the future, my personal belief, should be a fully integrated part of the business that you're driving. There's a whole raft of HR work, by the way, taking place more and more in shared service structures, by employee self-help, etc. The part that is left, the core of the learning interventions, OEOD, the talent part, but specifically also the strategy. The obsession that I see for many years right now with business leaders to deal with the realities of today is frightening. It's understandable, but it's frightening. And I think one of the roles as HR we have, because we carry, for example, a talent agenda, careers don't happen in a quarter. Careers happen at least in 5, 10, 15 years. So we have this nugget in our hands that we could better use if we are part of the business. When you set yourself outside that business, then it becomes a conversation of graphs, of succession matrices, etc. And in many cases actually misses the point. Because the real point is, where is this business now? What is the competitive environment? Where will it take us? And if we want to get there, what sort of people do we need? And for that, you have to be at the heart of that conversation. And I would be lying to you if you're completely there. But I'm getting close in my business, which is quite enjoyable, actually. And frightening at times. Yeah. Good.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Thank you.